you've mentioned the word security several times now. Are you a security company or an enterprise mobility management company?
We spent a lot of time answering that question when I first got to Good. We'd have lots of healthy debates because there is such a strong heritage. There are those that would say Good is a mobile productivity company, and then there would be those that say no, Good is a mobile security company. So, you know, I think we do all of those things. I sort of equate it to, you know, within Microsoft you have sort of Outlook and Exchange, and you also have Windows, and I think that's the difference between Good Dynamics and Good for Enterprise. But I like to think of us as a secure mobility company, and again, the applications of that security architecture. Security is something we're very, very good at. We're the only software solution that's been given Common Criteria Level 4. So it's clearly a big part of our DNA, but it's really about removing that tension between the CEO, CMO that says, hey, I've got a great big idea, and IT and security that are saying, no, no, you can't do that. And that could take a whole bunch of different implementations out in the world.
So at first glance, it's about making sure that you can take the security concern off the table.
I think that's it. I think we have a large part of our conversation, we sort of phrase it you see, we see, as in, you know, when you're looking at an opportunity, half of the conversation is about the opportunity and the other half of the conversation is about the risk. And we believe that we come right into the middle of that and say, you know, we can manage the risk so you can seize the opportunity. And if it's, whether it's using our solutions, developing your own, working with our broad ecosystem, and it's not a single product, right? I know yesterday our conversation was very much sort of a debate of technologies. Is it MDM? Is it virtualization? Is it containerization? I think to the CIO the answer is yes. It's all of those things, depending on the problem you're trying to solve. And so
you actually just did the straight woman for my next question, which was earlier we had Sanjay Poonen on stage and we were talking about virtualization. And in some ways we could say that what you've done is a very similar equivalent to virtualization, things put into a container. How do you see virtualization fitting in? Is that competitive? Is it just a different way of doing things? Do you view yourself in the virtualization space?
We're not currently in the virtualization space, so just so that I'm using terms and they might not be consistent with what was spoken about this morning, you know, in my mind, virtualization, you're either virtualizing a platform or you're running a platform from the sky, so cloud, whether it's server-based or device-based. And I tend to simplify it and think about where are you drawing the perimeter. So if we're talking about device management, I'm drawing the perimeter around the hardware. If I'm talking about virtualization or dual persona, I'm drawing a perimeter around an operating system regardless of where it's running. And I think with containerization, we're drawing the perimeter around the application and specifically the data, because we allow data to travel between applications. And I'm back to the answer is yes. You know, they're only competitive to the extent that an IT manager or a CIO or a CMO is trying to solve a particular problem and they're unclear about which tool solves which problems. And I think different use cases require different solutions. So, you know, some examples. I think if you think about an application that I only need to log into once or twice a week, and it's okay for me to put down on the user that they need to be on Wi-Fi network or they need to be in a strong data connection, you know, then that is probably a great example for a whole host of solutions like virtualization or cloud streaming. You know, if it's something that they're going to be doing all day, every day, you're going to need to have something native in order to get the user experience. I think as much as we like to talk about security qualifications and we like to, you know, pat ourselves on the back and say we get this badge and that badge and we're in all of these federal governments, I think at the end of the day, the biggest liability ends up becoming the user. If you choose the wrong tool to solve the problem, the user ends up becoming the area of exposure, right? If I try to solve what should be a containerization solution with device management or virtualization, the user will forward their data to somewhere where they can get their job done, and they just sort of worked against you and defeated the whole purpose. So, not always competitive.
Yeah, the user is the biggest security risk. I absolutely agree with that. That makes sense. So one of the things that's happened in mobility that's been very challenging for us is that we've had this proliferation of mobile operating systems. And we could also say that one of the things that's very challenging is that now if I want to do application wrapping, I'm really doing the same thing. I'm picking a platform and then I'm wrapping all of my applications in that. So it's another choice around how do I deal with this diversity. And some people are opposed to this concept of needing to pick, say, the good dynamics and doing an SDK and things around that. What do you see as the evolution of application wrapping? I mean, is this where it's going to be, or is there another click that we get to that's easier?
You know, I am a big believer in standards and common platforms. I do think that when you get to something like security architecture, you know, things have to speak a common language. So there are lots of instances in the world where you might not care about that. And so there are absolutely examples of where data gets passed between applications. Think of opening a document in a native email app, which might have encryption turned on, and then passing it over to another app that might be wrapped by something else. Both of those are secure, and so there's nothing that prevents them from sharing data. The challenge is, if you're in a highly security-minded organization, the data traveling between them is the white space you kind of need to be afraid of. And so in order to solve that problem, you really have to either be in the same container or speaking a common language. And so with good dynamics, we don't force everything in the same container. We just expose the language so that they can expose services, publish things between them. So for example, HP's done, you know, ePrint. So they can expose a print API, and then anybody that wants to print can call into that secure printing API. It would be really hard to do if they weren't speaking a common language. So there's nothing that stops us from publishing specs to a point. And if we go beyond that, I think that it takes a bigger level of collaboration across the industry. And I just don't think we're there yet. I don't think we know enough yet about kind of where things are going to settle out with the customers and what they're trying to do with them.
Great. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to go to the audience for questions. So, as I mentioned earlier, you've actually had a very interesting career that's been related to software and working with developers. What have you learned in those previous years that you will bring to good to change and enhance products and services?
Get out of their way, right? So I think that if we impose an architecture that, you know, we could have taken a different approach. So we could have said, we need to build secure printing and good for enterprise, and we need to, you know, figure out how to do electronic signatures, or we need to figure out, you know, I think that the biggest lesson learned by the industry as a whole is where there's an opportunity for an ecosystem, you have to plant the seeds and get out of the way. And so I think we're working hard to try to make that, we're helping that ecosystem grow. We're putting the tools out, we're investing a lot in the marketing, our partners are getting access to customers and making money, and all of the things required in order to make a healthy, ecosystem. Ecosystems aren't really an ecosystem if you're not making money as a result of your investment. But I think trying to make sure that we've established an architecture where people can benefit without having a lot of help from us. And it's not that we're unwilling to. We do a lot of joint sales and joint marketing with our partners, and how do we focus on making sure the customer has access to everything. But we're never going to have all of the great ideas, right? So this whole services-driven architecture is really interesting because it means especially within a large organization, we have some companies, like USAA, for example, that just kind of gave the tools to their entire development organization and said, good dynamics for everybody, and had kind of a hackathon, which might be an unfortunate name for the exercise, but the results were really great, where they had hundreds of application ideas come forward, and instead of shutting them down, they were all done with a common set of tools, and so they could pick those ideas and figure out how to take them forward and commercialize them. And there's probably no way in the beginning that they knew all of the different mobile applications, all the various different departments wanted to do, and try to weave them together. So giving them the tools and the architecture, and then get out of the way.
I lied. I'm going to ask one more question. If we look out 12 months from now, what do you as a CEO need to do to execute and make good successful? What's your action plan?
Wait, is this being recorded? I'm not sure. This event is happening in 12 months. It might get played back up on a wall. I think that so we're doing great, and I'm not being immodest in saying that because I'm relatively new, so I don't necessarily take all the credit for that. I think that our customers are doing amazing things with mobility, so we have to continue to step up to that challenge. I think mobility has changed, and we talked a little bit about this yesterday. Mobility has changed from being kind of the afterthought. Maybe 10 to 15% of the employees could have a smartphone, which is sort of where we were in the last era, where there was one flavor of smartphone to give folks. It was given to the C-level executives and the sales reps. And I think now we're going through that era where the training wheels are on and they're centralizing mobility and they're figuring out how to mobilize more stuff. But you know, the number of times we sit down with the CIO in an organization and help put together board pages for going to their board of directors and talking about the risk of mobility. You know, the number of times we sit at a table where they're talking about the broader implications of mobility on their core business. And that's the opportunity. And so from a company like ourselves and a number of the other companies in the room, our success is going to be dependent on our ability to continue to sort of walk in those shoes, because the expectations have changed. It's not this sort of cute little sort of mobile solution. This is the core of how they're going to run their business. More and more of their own R&D dollars and their own innovation is going to go into how they transform their own business. And mobility just happens to be the platform that they're running on. And so that has huge implications on customer care and support. It has huge implications on service time and reliability, how we architect our products, the kinds of partners we align with, what our channels look like. So it's big.
What's the biggest hole you think you have to plug in the next 12 months?
You keep saying one more question, and then there's just one more question.
I just can't help myself.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
The biggest hole you feel you need to fill in the next 12 months?
I think it's execution. I feel like I'm blessed to come into a company that has such a rich portfolio of technology, that has such a rich history of innovation. We have just such an amazing community of customers and partners we get to work with. And so I think for us, it's execution. There's not a, you know, if I put the architecture map up on the wall, it's not as though I can point and go, oh, there's just that one hole I have to plug. You know, I feel great about the products and I feel great about where customers are going. And so it's our ability to make sure that we are keeping up with them and we're supporting them and that we are enabling them to drive as hard and as fast as they want to be going, which is pretty fast right now.
All right, so let's hear about what the customers and prospects think about Good and what they want to know about. Any questions in the audience? Questions. There's one there. Where's Phil? Where's Paul? Am I going to have to run a mic down? I am. Hold on. Who had a question? I can't see the. Was it Judy? Hi.
So I think we're all here because the consumers have really led this mobility push. And now we're trying to satisfy the enterprise. But I'm concerned that we are then compromising what got us here in the first place. So when I look at Good, and while you can continue to enhance what is in your offering, it's not the user experience that I would expect it to be. And I'm afraid that my employees have a job to be done. And if I give them tools and they go, but that's not making the cut, they're still going to find a way to get the job done, and all of it will be compromised. What are you doing to address that?
I think it's a very fair point. I think we've spent a ton of time talking about user experience. So just to be clear, I think there's two parts of the conversation, right? I think that there's the user experience of the apps we write, and then there's sort of what you do with them. So we have a lot of customers who are not using any of our applications at all, that are doing their own applications on Good Dynamics. And so the user experience from their definition is really about some of the things we talked about before: simplicity, you know, the quality of service, et cetera. On the collaboration apps themselves, I would say two pieces. The first is we are spending a lot of time going through and looking at our next generation suite of applications and what does next generation messaging and collaboration look like. The second point is I think that the user experience when you don't use a collaboration suite like that actually suffers far more. So we have a lot of customers who are running parallel tracks where they will have kind of a app-driven model for either BYO or corporate liable, and it flips back and forth depending on the customer. And they will say, if you want to bring your own device, you can install Good, and if you want to, for us to give you a device, we'll buy a device, but we're going to put MDM on it. And there's a short-term sort of euphoria where they go, yay, I get to use the native email client. And then they're calling and going, wait a minute, I don't have meeting management support, I don't have delegation support, I don't have, my IT has turned off my ability to turn on attachments, or I can open attachments and I can edit them, but I can't send them back because that's also a security liability. And so there's a lot of complexity, I think, in mixing the models. So we're happy to sit down and go through where we've seen best practices for either side, because we have customers that are doing both. And getting to the best user experience, and we are absolutely investing. There's a huge part of my legacy DNA from the companies I've come from that just would love to see us do more beautiful, more polished kind of collaboration services. And I think you're starting to see some of that in the releases that have been coming out the last couple of months. You'll see even more of that as we go into the first half of next year.
Another question from the audience? Phil has the mic.
Leap. Excuse me. Christy, I like the answer that you're giving as far as collaboration, but I think what we're talking about is your apps themselves. You guys do not have UI and UX designers at all. You haven't had them for 12 years, because I've been a customer of yours for 12 years. And I guess the question is, with your DNA, how are you really going to push that forward, change that? Because I agree with you, there are features there for security and everything else, but if you're colorblind, you run into problems because you're red and white. If you have, and that's just basic. There are things that you guys are 6, 8, 9 months behind on adding features. It's one thing if we turn them off, it's another thing when we can't turn them on.
So I'm going to correct one small thing you said, which is we don't have UX designers. We actually have some amazing UX designers. They just weren't really empowered. So I think for those of you who have run software companies or been inside software companies, how you develop software is as important as, and who gets the final vote on what happens. And if your roadmap process sort of runs along the lines of, and maybe some of you in software companies can resonate with this, there's this bucket of UX work that's really, really important and we all would really love to do. But customer X needs support for XYZ security architecture, and so at the last minute folks were, and I think that's a large part of how small companies kind of grow as rapidly as Good did. We've actually re-engineered the entire way that we design and develop software. UX actually has an allocated section percentage of the R&D that's going into our releases, which started probably, as I said, you see it coming out in the releases that you'll start seeing it towards the end of this year, and you'll see more of it as we go into the first half of next year. In some cases, you'll see some of our products completely re-engineered. I actually really love some of the work that our UX guys have done. I just think that for a security-minded company, the prioritization was always put on more security. And I think this concept that if you don't get UX right, you create the security liability through the user is kind of a really important argument. And so we are switching R&D over to kind of better empower and even organizationally aligned around empowering some of the UX leadership within the organization. So my invitation would be, sit down with me in 3 months and go through your wish list and see how good we did. Or come back to this event next year is what Maribel's going to say.
Yeah, M12, when we have M12. We have another question.
I promise, just because we're sitting next to each other, we didn't plan this. But you talked before, Christy, about the importance of removing the roadblocks and how to help make enterprises' lives easier. And there's one thing that's just this really nagging, stupid, irritating thing that we all have to deal with, and that's this idea of Good seems to carry a carrier tax with a lot of the other vendors. So Verizon, particularly here in the US, but also outside as well. And you don't see that so much with the other ones. And it becomes a barrier from a cost perspective or even from an ease of use perspective where you say, I don't want to deal with that. So what are you doing in those discussions to try and remove that barrier? Because I'm sure it's probably not so much a question of income and revenue for you as much as it is whatever you need to do to get the job done.
Yeah. This session's being recorded. We might have a longer conversation about that one offline, but my perspective on this is, first of all, the operators, and this is country dependent, the operators have a very clear mindset in most cases about how they want to manage enterprise data. And in a time when enterprise was a big driver for a lot of the data, maybe that made sense. I said yesterday, I'm not necessarily in alignment that it makes sense today. So to the extent that somebody wants to wage a knock tax with my name on it, then we're going to have a conversation about where that money goes. To the extent that we want to remove the barrier for customers on using data-driven sources, I'm happy to have that conversation with any enterprise anytime. So first of all, on a company-by-company basis, we can do very specific things with almost all of our operator customers. And so we can have that conversation as well. If there's a company for whom that's an obstacle, you should come talk to us because we can have that discussion. But more broadly, I sort of say to the carrier community and to the software industry as a whole, which is, you know, if we're going to take it down, let's take it down. Let's stop charging users based on the kinds of apps they install and start charging them on the kind of data they're using. And I talked yesterday about some really easy things to do where you could actually start creating monetization areas around the data being driven by the application itself. So wouldn't it be great to put out a policy out to the employees that say, I will give you the good client, you can download the good client, and I will charge you at the end of the month for the amount of data that flowed through that. So you'd get web traffic through our secure browser, you'd get all the email, all the calls that were launched as a result of coming through your good application. So if there was a way that we could aggregate the data being driven by enterprise and that you could compensate your employees just for that, that could be a really cool thing, right? And then the question back to some of the service providers would be, why are you charging an extra tax or insisting on a separate data plan to support a certain set of applications? So it's not a problem I can solve on my own, but I've said many times internally and externally, I'm completely open to solving it with whoever wants to step up.
I think we have time for one more question. Is there one more question in the audience? Going once, going twice.
Really? After all the really interesting questions you're asking, that's it?
That's it? All right. I guess I will close with the last question then, because I always have questions. And my question to you is, as people go out and are looking to evaluate solutions, what's one critical element they shouldn't miss? Something they really need to be concerned with. We've talked about security, but anything in specific in security or anything specific?
I just think it's a very confusing time right now, and a lot of the companies we're talking to, and we have the broad spectrum, right? A lot of our customers are some of the most forward-thinking mobility companies you've ever talked to. At one of our recent customer advisory boards, one of the analysts said, how many of you have talked to your board of directors about your mobility policy? And I think 2/3 of the room raised their hand, which was huge, right? Back to, the folks that are just doing it for the very first time, just starting down this path. And I think that there's a lot of confusion. When you're in any market segment where there's 122 vendors showing up on a Magic Quadrant that are all sort of up and coming, that's a crowded space, and there's a lot of noise and a lot of confusion about who can do what, and everybody tries to make the stories sort of all the same. I think that the question you have to start with is, don't be forced into a reaction. So I think somebody said this started because the consumers were putting the pressure on us. I think we sort of encourage customers to kind of draw the line and take a step back and say, where would you like mobility to take you as a business? And then what are the tools required in order to implement that vision? And I think that tools, it's going to be plural, right? So we have MDM, we have containerization. We don't have virtualization predominantly just because I haven't seen a virtualization experience that customers could absorb yet, but that doesn't mean I don't believe it will ever happen.
You should have seen Sanjay's presentation. He was making it look pretty smooth earlier today.
I missed it. I missed it by this much. So I just think, start with the problem you're trying to solve, and then let that drive your technology choices. If you start with the bits, right? If you start by saying who's the most secure or who's the most, you're going to end up with some technology, but a lot of the technology projects gone awry, where we sort of get the phone call to come back in and kind of, help, is when they thought they were solving security, but they were solving management, or they thought that they were going to solve an offline problem and they could only solve an online problem. And so this is a very savvy group, but I would say you really kind of have to be the leader in your organization and kind of step forward and sort of stop the reactiveness and say, let's forward looking. What impact could mobility have on our business? And then what technology decisions would be required in order to support that vision?
Okay. Very, very, very last question. And I'm thrilled that you brought up the whole G company and the Magic Quadrant and all that stuff, because there has been a lot of discussion about growth and how do companies grow in such a crowded space. How will you measure success next year?
Our customers will tell us whether we're successful. So, I think that we have a very impressive, we're in 8 of the 10 world's largest banks. We're in a lot of international federal governments. About 50% of our customers come out of regulated industries. So I don't think we have a shortage of people giving us feedback, even in the room. I think that,
Brian never has a shortage of feedback, that's for certain.
I think that, we have customers that are taking mobility to have as many devices as you want, have as many different kinds of devices as you want, and every employee could be empowered in mobile in one way, shape, or form. And so I think our success is really going to be based on customer satisfaction at the end of the year. It's, you know, we have activations and new logos abound. I think that it's really, you know, our customers able to achieve their end goals. And I think every year that's what I'm really excited to hear about. It's getting those sort of customer success stories where they come in and show us the cool app with the virtual reality that their partners are actually using in the field today, and you go, that's super cool.
Perfect. Well, thank you for your time, your intention, and dealing with the million questions. Thank you very much. Hand, Christy. So this is the last of you'll see of me on stage today. We have some other lovely people coming up to help with the rest of the program, and we'll have Kristen Laurier from IBM a little later, and I believe Bob Egan's running a panel. And I'm going to turn it over to Phil, who can tell you about some logistics. Thank you.